Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a Europe you've never really seen before. Not the one of white marble statues or icy palaces you half remember from school, but one humming with color, spice, and skin tones as varied as the earth itself. You step into the candlelit chamber of a medieval scribe, the smell of old parchment and sheep tallow thick in the air. He's bent over a map of Europe, but the shapes are strange. Jagged coastlines, mythical beasts crowding the margins, oceans crawling with sea serpents. You lean closer, and you see something most modern maps forgot: faces. Dark-skinned kings, queens, and knights inked into the corners, their names nearly erased by time. You probably won't survive this rabbit hole of forgotten history. But don't worry, that's the fun part. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trace your finger across that brittle map, past the British Isles, through France, down toward Iberia, where a deep, burnished ink stains the parchment. It's as though the mapmaker tried to scrub something away. A king, perhaps. A dynasty. A presence too bold for his time. You follow the faint outlines of African trade winds, drifting north across the Sahara, curling into Europe like a secret breath. Somewhere along those roads, before borders hardened, before anyone said, medieval, black rulers, generals, and envoys walked these same roads. You can almost hear it. The shuffle of sandals through the dust, the murmur of markets where gold from Mali gleams beside Byzantine silk. You smell roasted cumin and hot wax. You hear the jangle of coins struck from African ore. This is where Europe begins to darken, not in shadow, but in richness. A mainstream fact slides into place. By the 8th century, Muslim armies from North Africa had swept into Iberia, founding the Kingdom of Al-Andalus. That's not revisionism, it's history. Yet, when you think of medieval Europe, the image that comes to mind is often pale and cold. The truth: Europe was a mosaic, and part of that glittering glass was carved by hands from across the Sahara. You pause by the edge of the map. A note scrawled in Latin curls around the margin. Reges nigri, invisibles nunc. Black kings, now unseen. The scribe probably didn't mean it as poetry, but you feel it like one. You imagine him dipping his quill, pausing as he remembers tales of dark, skinned envoys arriving in London bearing ivory, or the Ethiopian monks who sang in the chapels of Rome. Historians still argue whether these figures were anomalies or ambassadors of larger, sustained power, a quiet correction to the myth that Africa and Europe were strangers until ships and chains met on Atlantic waters. You take a step back. The candlelight trembles. The scribe glances up. Maybe he sees you, or maybe he only feels the draft of curiosity you've carried across centuries. He sighs, shakes his head, and begins sketching over a face with pale ink. Another one forgotten. The quill scratches like rain. You wander behind him, whispering through the cracks of his imagination, searching for what was lost. Far south, in the lands once called Nubia, empires rose and fell with the Nile's moods. To the north, in Byzantine halls, African diplomats dined beneath gold mosaics, and across the narrow sea, Moorish princes from Morocco and Mali carved their stories into the soil of Spain and Sicily. Yet in later retellings, their skin tones faded, as if the parchment itself chose amnesia. You lift another map, one drawn centuries later. All the dark faces are gone. The dragons, oddly, remain priorities. And it hits you: history often keeps its monsters, but loses its men. You drift through a gallery of illuminated manuscripts, saints with halos, queens with blank stares, knights with immaculate armor. But in the margins, you notice something subtle. Brown hands holding swords, curly hair beneath helmets. Little brushstrokes of truth peeking through the whitewash of centuries. It's oddly comforting, proof that memory resists. Even when it's powdered beneath time, it lingers. You stroll into a cathedral archive, your breath echoing off the stone. The archivist doesn't see you, of course. You're just a ghost of curiosity tonight. But your eyes scan the dusty ledgers. Lists of foreign dignitaries, court musicians, mercenaries, physicians. Some names shimmer like half, translated Wispus Yusuf of Fez, Morris the Wise, Godfrey the Moor. One fringe tidbit leaps from the margins. A 14th century record describing a dark king who ruled a small alpine territory for a single season after a noble's sudden death. Was it true? Was it rumor? Historians still argue whether the man was a freed African knight or a myth stitched from fear and admiration. Either way, his presence was written, then scratched out, then rediscovered by some modern scholar squinting through microfilm. You imagine that scholar now, pale eyes wide, muttering, "Wait, why didn't anyone tell me this?" You smile. Welcome to the club. The night deepens. You move from map to memory, through rooms thick with forgotten ink. Every few steps, the air feels warmer, as if the ghosts of these rulers still carry a bit of desert sun. In one corner lies a cracked shield, its metal etched with Kufic script, Arabic calligraphy, on a weapon found in a Frankish grave. The curators chalk it up to trade or loot, but you can feel a story humming underneath, perhaps a shared campaign, a friendship between men of different faiths who both believed in steel more than sermons. You linger there, tracing your fingertip over the inscription. Al-Malik Yom al-Haku. The king on the day of truth. You whisper it aloud, and for a second, the dust swirls like a sigh. A low chuckle rises in your throat. You realize you're speaking to ghosts again. You always do that around midnight. The candles flicker lower. You notice something strange. One map near the back of the room shows a coastline that doesn't exist anymore. Kingdom of the Blacks, marked somewhere between Iberia and the Pyrenees. Clearly, a cartographer's fantasy. Or maybe, like many fantasies, it's a translation of half-remembered fact. The line between myth and history, after all, is usually drawn by whoever owns the ink. You feel a little chill. Maybe it's from the draft. Or maybe from realizing that for centuries, the black presence in Europe wasn't erased in one dramatic act. It was slowly, methodically sanded away, each generation trimming the truth a little neater, until the maps gleamed spotless again. The scribe finishes his last stroke, stretches, and sets his quill aside. His ink-stained fingers linger on the parchment. You lean over his shoulder, see your reflection in the glass of an oil lamp. It wavers like a question. Who gets to draw the world? You back away slowly. The candle gutters, dies. The map fades to black, but the image stays behind your eyelids, a continent, once crowded with kings of every hue, their crowns glinting not in paintings or fairy tales, but in dusty record books waiting to be read again. Somewhere outside, church bells toll. Midnight. Morning. Hard to tell in a dream. You stretch your legs and keep walking, because the story doesn't stop here. The ink might fade, but the road goes on. And as you step out of that archive, the night opens into the dawn of the first forgotten kingdoms. The lands before Europe had borders or excuses, when dark-skinned rulers rode beside pale ones, and no one yet thought to call it strange. You step into dawn, not the crisp European one you might expect, but something warmer, heavier with dust and light. The world before the kingdoms had names, smells like wet clay and crushed herbs. You can taste salt in the air, carried by winds from the Mediterranean. This is a Europe still half dreaming, a patchwork of tribes and trading towns that barely know what Europe means yet. You walk along a road that isn't quite a road, just a line of pressed dirt carved by sandals, hooves, and hopes. It snakes from the North African coast, through the silent dunes, and up towards southern France and Spain. This is where it begins. The merging, the mingling, the quiet migration of ideas and people that historians later call contact. As if it were accidental, when really it was inevitable. You pass a caravan of traders under the glare of the rising sun. They carry sacks of salt and slabs of gold, ebony wood, carved ivory, and stories. Always stories. One man hums a song in an ancient Nubian dialect, another replies in rough Latin. The words don't match, but the rhythm does. There's something oddly familiar about this scene. Like an early version of globalization, minus the Wi-Fi and bad airport coffee. You watch as they swap goods, then laughter, then maybe recipes. A clay pot of honey changes hands for a polished bronze knife. Someone sneezes. The universal sign that you've been breathing history too long. By the time the group reaches the foothills of Iberia, the air cools. They pause before the glittering sea. Across that water lies a land of opportunity and skepticism. Kingdoms not yet unified. Religions still negotiating their boundaries. But for these travelers, the sea isn't a barrier, it's a bridge. And here's your first mainstream fact of the night. Archaeological digs in southern Spain and southern France have unearthed African origin artifacts dating to centuries before the Moorish conquests. Proof that trade between the Maghreb and Europe existed long before swords and sultans entered the story. You bend down to examine a shard of pottery glinting in the sand. Painted in ochre and black, it shows two faces. One light, one dark, sharing a cup. Maybe coincidence, maybe intention. Historians still argue whether these images represent friendship or hierarchy. But as you trace the curved line of the cup, it feels less like a debate and more like a toast across centuries. A child runs past, chasing a goat with more ambition than balance. His laughter rings against the cliffs, echoing into the waves. You follow him down to a small village of reed huts and clay ovens. Women grind grain on stone slabs, their voices low and rhythmic. They nod as travelers pass. No suspicion here, just curiosity. Skin tones range from sand to mahogany, hair from tight curls to sun-bleached tangles. No one cares where anyone comes from. Everyone's too busy staying alive and making bread. You watch as a dark-skinned man with scars on his arms kneels beside a young European boy, showing him how to knot fishing nets so the catch won't slip away. The boy copies him clumsily, then grins when it holds. The man laughs softly. You'd swear you just witnessed civilization being passed hand to hand. A quirky tidbit flickers in your memory. An early medieval chronicle from Provence mentions Ethiopian merchants who taught locals the secret of sea knots and dyes from the shells of the sea. The chronicler, naturally, took all the credit for discovering it later. Typical. As the day lengthens, you climb a ridge overlooking the coastline. From here, you can see where Africa blurs into Europe, where geography doesn't argue. It simply folds. A single, ancient trail cuts through olive groves and heads north, carrying gold dust, faith, and curiosity. You follow it, letting your mind drift into the space between legend and fact. Imagine somewhere in this early era, before the grand castles and crusades, small communities of African merchants and scholars settled quietly in southern ports. They intermarried, traded, advised, and built the quiet foundations of what later became European civilization. But because they didn't carve monuments to themselves, history misplaced them. The wind shifts. You hear faint chanting from a distant temple, or maybe a church. Hard to tell. Both are still figuring out what they are. The sound is low and resonant, sung in multiple tongues. You lean closer. It's worship, but it's also longing. These are people straddling two worlds, one rooted in the sands of Nubia and Mali, another budding in the forests of Gaul and Iberia. You think of the scribe from the map room, the one erasing faces. If he had seen this scene, what would he have written? Maybe nothing. Maybe the silence of his ink was the loudest confession of all. You keep walking north. The land grows greener. You cross rivers that glitter like molten glass. Occasionally, you spot a Roman milestone still standing, chipped, moss-covered, but stubbornly upright. On one, faint letters remain. Miles Niger Dux Commercy. The black soldier, leader of trade. You blink. That can't be right. But the engraving is old enough to be sincere. And here comes the open scholarly debate moment. Historians still argue whether Niger. In such inscriptions referred to complexion, rank, or a symbolic title. Some say it meant dark in armor, others dark in origin. Either way, someone dark stood here once, commanding trade in a land that now pretends not to remember him. The sun begins to drop behind the hills. You find yourself sitting by a small fire with two travelers. One from the Atlas Mountains, his skin deep bronze, his beard streaked with grey. The other, a woman from Gaul with amber hair and sharp eyes. They don't share a language, but somehow, over bread and figs, they laugh at the same jokes. You realize this is how civilizations actually grow, not through conquest, but conversation. The old man leans in, points to the horizon, and mutters a name. Tariq. You'll hear that name again later, as Tariq ibn Ziyad, the Berber general who leads the armies into Iberia in the early 8th century, lending his name to Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. But here, he's just a rumor traveling along trade winds, a whisper of things to come. You lie back, staring at the stars. The constellations look slightly off, not the tidy Greek ones, but vast, looping African maps of the heavens. A shepherd traces them for you with a crooked stick, telling you stories of lions and hunters and rivers that flow across the sky. You listen, half awake, half entranced. For a moment, the universe feels borderless. A sudden breeze rustles the trees. You think about how easily memory can vanish, how one gust of wind, one lost chronicle, can erase entire dynasties. Yet here, before the kingdoms have names, the truth feels alive again. You can see it in the mingling faces, in the hands passing bread, in the faint traces of Nubian pigments staining Iberian walls. You stretch, letting the fire's warmth soak into your skin. The woman from Gaul hums a lullaby that sounds suspiciously like an old Saharan melody. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. The night deepens, and you realize you've been traveling through more than geography. You've been moving through layers of forgetfulness, beneath the grand narrative of Europe rising from darkness. There's another current, quiet, constant, glowing with heat, carried from Africa's heart. You sit in silence, watching embers collapse into ash. The traders sleep, the child dreams, the waves hiss softly below. Somewhere in those whispers, you sense the first foundations of what will become courts, crowns, and chronicles. But for now, it's just people, brown, black, pale, sharing warmth against the cold. You yawn, stretch again. Maybe tomorrow you'll follow that rumor of Tariq. Maybe you'll trace the path of the scholars who carried scrolls from Timbuktu before the word Timbuktu meant anything exotic. For tonight, you just watch the horizon burn softly gold, where Africa and Europe kiss in silhouette. In the stillness, one last thought drifts through your mind. Maybe history didn't forget these black kings. Maybe it just fell asleep on the job. You wake to the sound of prayer, low, rhythmic, and hauntingly beautiful. The kind that seems to hum from the earth itself. The air smells of citrus and sea salt, and when you open your eyes, you're standing on a hill overlooking a city made of light. Whitewashed walls gleam under the Spanish sun, and delicate arches stretch like poetry written in stone. You've arrived in Al-Andalus, the realm where Africa and Europe met, argued, married, and invented a golden age. Below you, the Guadalquivir River curls like a ribbon of silver, threading through Cordoba. It's the 10th century, maybe earlier. You can never tell in dreams. The city hums with life. Scholars in flowing robes, artisans hammering brass lamps, merchants shouting over the scent of saffron and roasted lamb. And somewhere in that swirl of language and laughter walks a black king. Or at least a man who could have been one, if time had remembered his name. You drift closer, past a market stall where figs sit piled like treasure. A merchant eyes you curiously. Your clothes too modern, your stare too long. You mumble something about research. And he shrugs, offering a slice of melon anyway. Sweet, cold. Human kindness tastes the same in every century. The Moorish dawn is everywhere here. You can feel it in the geometry. The perfect logic of tiles, the cool symmetry of gardens. It's civilization reborn from memory, a collaboration between Berbers, Arabs, Africans, and the local Iberians who decided that knowledge, not conquest, made a kingdom. Mainstream fact for this chapter: during the height of Andalus, cities like Cordoba and Granada were among the most advanced in Europe, boasting paved streets, public baths, libraries with hundreds of thousands of books, and hospitals where scholars from Africa and Europe studied side by side. You walk through one of those libraries now. Shelves rise around you like a forest of wisdom. Scrolls, manuscripts, maps. A man with dark skin and gold-threaded sleeves looks up from his desk. He's copying an ancient Greek text into Arabic, occasionally stopping to add his own commentary in the margins. His name, he tells you softly, is Abbas ibn Firnas. You blink. The Abbas ibn Firnas, the polymath from Ronda, who supposedly tried to fly centuries before Leonardo. He nods, amused by your expression. You from the future? He teases. You admit it. He laughs. A warm, full sound. Then you already know how badly I'll land. You smile, but your chest tightens. Because you do know. You remember the story. How Abbas crafted wings of silk and wood, launched himself from a hill, and glided briefly before tumbling down. He survived, mostly. A man who believed he could fly, punished only by gravity's impatience. The scholars here don't see themselves as African or European. Those are later inventions. To them, the world is a single vast classroom. Yet, as you glance around the library, you notice how many faces bear the deep bronze tones of the Maghreb, the Sahel, even the Horn of Africa. Moors, Nubians, Berbers. The labels shift, but the roots are the same. Outside, the sun beats down on the city's tiled roofs. You wander into a courtyard where a fountain murmurs softly. Around it, philosophers debate the shape of the universe. One claims stars are made of fire. Another insists they are windows into paradise. A young student, his skin dark and luminous under the light, raises a hand. Maybe, he says quietly, they are both. A moment of silence. Then laughter. You love this place already. You step deeper into the city. The call to prayer floats again through the air, weaving between the songs of distant church bells. A strange harmony. One that shouldn't work, but somehow does. You pause to watch as a Moorish noble greets a Christian envoy with a bow. Their languages differ, their gods perhaps disagree, but their respect is mutual. And here's your quirky tidbit. Historians have recorded a handful of North African nobles who married into Iberian Christian families during the 9th and 10th centuries. A detail often trimmed out of Western textbooks. One chronicler even described a dark-skinned prince who fathered children later baptized as Spanish lords. You won't find his portrait in museums, but his DNA probably still strolls through Seville, buying oranges. You walk along the stone alleys as dusk falls. The scent of jasmine wraps around you. Musicians tune their ouds beneath lanterns, the notes lazy and liquid. You stop by one corner, where a storyteller spins tales of the dark kings from across the desert who came with books, not swords. His audience leans in, eyes wide. He points to the horizon where the red sun bleeds into the sea. They brought us numbers, medicine, poetry, even the stars, he says. Then he smiles and adds, and yet someday, they'll call them foreigners. The crowd chuckles softly. You want to tell him how right he'll be, but you don't. History has to play out its own mistakes. You drift toward the palace. The fabled Madinat al-Zahra, the city within a city. Marble columns glimmer under torchlight. Mosaics shimmer in reds and blues. Inside, the caliph sits upon a low throne, surrounded by advisors of every complexion. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, catches your eye. His skin a deep mahogany, his posture noble. You catch his name in the murmured introduction, Ziryab. Ah yes, Ziryab. The black polymath from Baghdad by way of North Africa, who revolutionized music, fashion, and dining in Al-Andalus. Historians still argue whether to call him a musician, a courtier, or a cultural architect. You'd call him the first influencer, minus the ring light. You watch as he demonstrates a new tune on a 5-string oud. The court falls silent, the air heavy with awe. When he finishes, the caliph applauds softly. You make sound visible, he says. Ziryab smiles, modestly dipping his head. Later, he'll introduce new table manners, seasonal menace, even toothpaste recipes. His legacy will ripple quietly through European refinement for centuries, though few will remember his face. Outside, night has taken over. The moon spills across the tiled roofs like milk. You stroll through the sleeping city, your footsteps echoing softly. Somewhere nearby, a poet recites verses under his breath. I was born of two worlds, kissed by sun and shadow, and I built my kingdom between them. The words hang in the air long after he's gone. You stop by the river again, watching reflections of lanterns drift downstream. Somewhere in those shimmering lights, you see the truth, that medieval Europe was never purely white or singular. It was a college, and for a few bright centuries, the Moors painted it gold. You feel a faint ache, because you know what comes next. Empires fall, knowledge burns, skin tones become symbols. The beautiful city will crumble, and memory will turn selective. Yet tonight, it still glows. The breeze cools your face. The water whispers softly against the stone. You whisper back, I see you. And for a heartbeat, it feels like the forgotten kings hear you too. You leave the warmth of Andalusian twilight behind and follow the quiet hum of marching boots. North again, into the heart of what the maps call Frankish lands. It's colder here, harsher. The soil is darker, the people broader in the shoulders, and the castles, well, draftier. You pull your cloak tighter, because even in dreams, medieval France doesn't do central heating. The world smells of iron and damp wool. Somewhere ahead, trumpets blare. A royal procession cutting through the mist. Charlemagne's court, they say. The great empire builder, the crowned defender of Christendom. You slip between onlookers, peasants, merchants, wandering monks. And there they are, knights in polished armor, their horses snorting steam into the cold. The banners ripple overhead, a thunder of color in the grey dawn. But one rider stands out. His skin is dark as oiled walnut, his armor etched with intricate North African motifs. Beneath his helmet, his eyes gleam, proud, amused, tired. He looks like he's been proving his worth for a very long time. A whisper passes through the crowd. Maurice, the Moor. A captain in Charlemagne's army. Some say a prince from across the sea who pledged loyalty to the Frankish king. And here's your mainstream fact. Frankish chronicles from the 8th and 9th centuries mention several black or Moorish knights in royal service. Men often referred to as Maurice, Nigellus, or simply the Dark One. Their origins are debated, their portraits non-existent, but their presence is carved quietly into the edges of medieval record. You follow Maurice as he dismounts. His boots sink into the mud with a soft squelch, a reminder that even legendary courts have lousy drainage. He's greeted by another knight, pale as parchment and equally tired. They clasp forearms, laughing over some private joke. You get the sense these men have fought side by side, bled together, shared the same stale ale after long campaigns. Morris removes his gauntlets and reaches for his sword. The blade gleams with Arabic inscriptions along its spine. One of the scribes nearby frowns. Arabic script in a Christian court. Scandalous. But Charlemagne, towering above the rest like a man born of legend, only nods in approval. "A fine blade," he says. "Where knowledge is found, take it. Where courage is shown, honor it." You can't help smirking. The king was a practical man. As the day wanes, the court gathers for a feast. You slip inside the hall, where roasted boar glistens under candlelight, and lute music hums low and lazy. The air smells of smoke and mead. Laughter ricochets between the stone walls. At one end of the long table sits Morris, telling a story that silences the chatter around him. His voice is calm, deep, the kind that turns even gossipers into listeners. He's describing a faraway city, perhaps from his homeland, where the rivers glow gold at sunset and scholars debate under palm trees. The courtiers listen like children hearing bedtime tales. One of them interrupts. "And they had kings there, real kings." Morris smiles, patient but sharp. "Yes," he says. "And poets. And mathematicians. And cooks better than yours." The table erupts in laughter. Even Charlemagne chuckles. And the moment passes without malice. You almost feel proud. Not for the retort itself, but for the ease with which he delivers it. "Here's your quirky tidbit, a 13th century French manuscript. La Chanson de Roland includes a black knight named Baligant, a noble enemy who duels the Frankish hero. Some scholars believe his depiction drew from real figures like Morris, African commanders respected, sappers, and feared across European battlefields. Whether fact or fable, the knight's dignity endures in verse. You watch as musicians begin to play. A Moorish melody, faintly Andalusian, faintly African, weaves through the room. Morris closes his eyes, fingers tapping to the rhythm. You wonder if the tune reminds him of home. Later that night, as the court sleeps, you find him standing alone by the fire. He's polishing his sword, movements slow, deliberate. The flames reflect off the bronze of his skin and the silver of the blade, a dance of light and dark that feels like history itself. He looks up suddenly, sensing you. For a moment, it feels as if he sees you across the centuries. "They'll forget," he says softly. "They'll remember the wars, the crowns, the bloodlines. But they won't remember this. That I stood here, that I mattered." You want to answer, to promise him he won't be forgotten. But words stick in your throat. Maybe because you know he's right. His name will fade into the generic more. His story melted into myth. He turns back to the fire. Still, he adds, the blade remembers. You glance at it again. The Arabic engraving glows faintly in the flicker. You mouth the words "honor knows no color." The next morning, rain sweeps across the camp. The knights mount their horses, banners snapping in the wind. The mud sucks at their boots, as if the earth itself doesn't want to let them go. Charlemagne rides ahead, Morris beside him, a silent sentinel in steel. As they pass through the mist, the sound of hooves fades into something softer. The hum of centuries turning. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne truly had black commanders in his army, or whether the Mori, referenced in texts, were mercenaries from Spain or North Africa. But you've seen enough to know. There were men here whose presence was too significant to be erased entirely, only blurred. You walk the empty camp, kicking at the mud where their footprints linger. Somewhere under the muck might lie a broken spur, a shard of steel, a bead from a prayer string, tiny relics of big lives. A stray dog wanders by, sniffs the ground, and decides you're uninteresting. Fair. You smile and keep walking north. The road curves through forests, thick with mist. Occasionally, you glimpse travelers. Monks with brown faces under their hoods. Pilgrims speaking Arabic, laced Latin. The empire sprawls wider than schoolbooks suggest. By nightfall you reach a small chapel perched on a hill. Inside, frescoes glow faintly by candlelight. One catches your eye: a knight kneeling before a cross, his skin unmistakably dark. The paint has flaked. The features softened, but you know that face. You whisper, "Morris." The walls don't answer, but the candle flickers like it remembers. Outside, stars break through the cloud cover, sharp and cold. You trace one with your gaze, maybe the same one Morris looked at on long campaigns, wondering if his family back home could see it too. You take a deep breath. The air smells of pine and rain and distance. Somewhere far behind, Andalusia still glows. Far ahead, Sicily waits with its own tangled stories. But for now, the night belongs to this forgotten knight, the one who fought, laughed, and dined beside kings in a world not ready to remember him. You whisper a quiet goodnight and step back into the dark. You drift south now, through mountains that hum with the heat of the Mediterranean sun. Sicily spreads below you like a mosaic, pale cliffs punctuated by citrus groves and terracotta roofs. The scent of roasted almonds drifts upward, carried by the wind, and you follow it toward the Norman palaces scattered along the coast. This is a kingdom in motion, a crossroads of cultures, where Latin, Greek, Arabic, and African voices converge like instruments in an orchestra tuning for the first time. The streets are narrow and winding, each turn revealing another patchwork of life. Merchants shout their wares in multiple languages. Children chase chickens past fountains whose mosaics shimmer under the sun. Somewhere, a lute plays a lazy tune. You step closer, mesmerized, and catch sight of a figure walking with quiet authority. His skin is deep bronze, his robe embroidered with gold thread, and his eyes scan the marketplace with the patience of a man who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. You know, even before anyone speaks, that he is one of Sicily's black advisors, perhaps even a prince, quietly guiding decisions behind the scenes. Unlike the loud kings and generals, his power is subtle, exercised through counsel, negotiation, and the art of being seen and unseen at once. Mainstream fact: Norman Sicily, especially during the 11th and 12th centuries, was one of Europe's most multicultural societies. African, Arab, Byzantine, and Latin influences combined in governance, architecture, and art. Kings relied heavily on advisors from diverse backgrounds, including North African and sub-Saharan origins. You follow him to the royal hall, where a feast is prepared with delicate saffron rice, spiced meats, and honey, sweet pastries. The Norman king, pale and tall, sits at the head of the table, but it is this dark-skinned advisor who subtly orchestrates the conversation. He leans in, whispering in the king's ear, and the monarch nods, laughing at a joke you cannot hear. The advisor smiles faintly, a private satisfaction. Here's your quirky tidbit. Chronicles tell of an African-born Sicilian advisor who introduced innovations in irrigation and citrus cultivation, helping to transform Sicily into a breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Historians still argue whether he was a formal noble or a highly trusted courtier, but the orchards don't lie. Outside, the Mediterranean sun beats down, and you wander through palace gardens, scented with jasmine and orange blossom. Fountains tinkle lazily, sending silver arcs into the warm air. Scholars from across the sea debate philosophy beneath colonnades, their skin shades ranging from caramel to pale ivory. You pass a young boy practicing calligraphy. His letters glide across the parchment with precision, tracing words in Arabic and Latin alike. You think of the roads that brought these people here. Caravans from Africa, ships from the Levant, travelers from France and Iberia. Each one left a mark, a story, a song, a recipe, a name. And yet, so many of these marks were quietly erased over the centuries. You enter a small chapel near the palace, where mosaics depict saints and kings. In one corner, you spot a figure whose skin is dark, his crown faint but unmistakable. You crouch, tracing the brushstrokes. This could be one of the Black Princes of Sicily, commemorated in art yet largely forgotten by history. The hallways echo with the soft clatter of servants' sandals. You pause by a window, watching ships glide into the harbour. Caravels, galleys, and merchant vessels bustle with cargo from Africa, the Levant, and Europe. Someone jokes about counting every coin, but you notice the advisor isn't laughing. His eyes are on the horizon, calculating, anticipating, planning. He knows trade is power, and power is survival. You wander into the market square as evening falls. Lanterns flicker, casting long shadows. Street performers juggle oranges, while a man recites poetry in a language that blends Arabic and local dialects. You realize this city is alive in a way modern maps and history books seldom capture. Every corner whispers stories of collaboration, of influence, of subtle power. A fleeting moment of scholarly debate crosses your mind. Historians still argue whether the African advisors in Norman Sicily were formally integrated into the nobility or functioned as exceptional, largely unofficial power brokers. Either way, their fingerprints remain in architecture, agriculture, and culture. Often hidden, sometimes celebrated, but rarely forgotten entirely. Night settles softly. You find a quiet bench overlooking the sea, the water reflecting lantern light in endless ripples. Somewhere, the Black Advisor's laughter drifts from a distant hall, subtle but unmistakable. You imagine him walking among courtiers, guiding kings with wisdom that cannot be captured in titles or paintings. The air smells of salt and orange blossoms. You close your eyes, listening to the hum of the city. Somewhere in the shadows, Sicily remembers him, even if the textbooks forget. You rise and walk toward the horizon. The waves lap softly against the shore, carrying echoes of trade, counsel, and quiet authority. In your mind, the Black Kings of Sicily stand tall, unshaken, shaping kingdoms without fanfare, their legacy hidden in gardens, canals, and the hum of a Mediterranean breeze. You leave the sun-baked streets of Sicily behind and follow the scent of desert winds carried across the Mediterranean. The road narrows, dust rising beneath your feet, as you trace the path of emissaries traveling from Nubia, ancient Kush, the land of gold, elephants, and pyramids that lean against the sky like questions. You can almost hear the creak of camels, the soft padding of sandals, the rhythmic chant of merchants speaking in multiple tongues. These emissaries are not conquerors, not merchants in the ordinary sense. They are diplomats, scholars, and royal envoys, traveling thousands of miles to court kings and emperors whose lands are stranger than their imagination. You follow them through Cairo, across the Sinai, over the Mediterranean, until finally they reach the European courts. Places of marble, cold stone, and long tables where kings sip mead and weigh decisions that affect hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives. Mainstream fact Nubia, particularly the Kingdom of Makuria and its neighbors, maintained diplomatic relations with European powers as early as the 8th century, exchanging envoys, luxury goods, and knowledge about warfare, religion, and agriculture. These journeys were perilous and expensive, but the rewards were influence and respect. You trail one Nubian envoy into a Venetian hall. Canals glisten outside, reflecting towers and bridges like liquid silver. Inside, the air smells of wax, fresh bread, and ink. Courtiers whisper, curious about the man in rich ochre robes with gold embroidery, sandals laced with care, and a crown, like turban, perched atop his head. His presence radiates authority without the need for a throne. He is presented to the Doge, and a hush falls over the chamber. He bows, and the ceremonial protocol begins, exchanging gifts, reciting lineage, promising loyalty or alliance. Yet he does more than speak, he observes. He reads expressions, gestures, and the subtle power dynamics in the room. A smile here, a pause there. He shapes European decisions without ever lifting a sword. Here's your quirky tidbit. Venetian chronicles note that Nubian emissaries often carried small gifts of exotic birds, spices, or gold dust in velvet pouches. One account even describes a delegation gifting a live crocodile, which caused panic in a courtyard full of pigeons and nobles alike. Historians still argue whether this story is fact, exaggeration, or a metaphor for the exoticness attributed to African visitors. Either way, it endures in the footnotes of history like a wink. You watch as the envoy presents a sealed letter, its script elegant and deliberate. The Doge receives it carefully, breaking the wax with an audible snap. Inside, the letter discusses trade agreements, alliances, and the sharing of knowledge, irrigation techniques, military tactics, and astronomical observations from the Nubian desert. The room murmurs. The envoy's reputation precedes him. Some whisper that he might outwit even the most cunning of Venetian counselors. At night, you stroll along the canals, listening to gondoliers singing songs of home. You imagine the Nubian envoy leaning against a bridge railing, the water reflecting his bronze skin and the stars above. He is both observer and participant, a bridge between worlds that rarely acknowledged one another fully. A mainstream fact blends with wonder. Some of these emissaries were trained in theology and diplomacy simultaneously, acting as priests, scholars, and negotiators all in one. Their influence shaped European courts more than most chroniclers cared to admit. You pause in a quiet piazza, where statues of long, dead doges gaze at you with stern, stony eyes. A stray cat brushes past your ankle, and for a moment you see the Nubian envoy in that cat. Elegant, moving unseen, threading through spaces he is not meant to occupy, yet claiming them naturally. Historians still argue whether the European elites fully understood the breadth of Nubian knowledge, or if they selectively absorbed what suited their ambitions. But standing here, under the Venetian moonlight, it's clear influence doesn't require recognition, only presence. The envoy walks past, a procession of shadows behind him. You follow just far enough to catch glimpses of his interactions, a subtle nod, a whispered suggestion, the quiet planting of ideas in receptive ears. He departs before most Europeans even realize a conversation has occurred, leaving only faint traces of gold dust and diplomacy in his wake. You step back from the water, inhaling the cool night air. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll, echoing across the city. You think of the roads he traveled, the deserts and seas he crossed, the faces he saw, the histories he touched. And yet, centuries later, few remember his name. The wind carries a faint whisper. I was here, and you hear it because you are listening. You rise early, walking into a soft European morning that smells faintly of damp stone and pine. The air carries the distant clatter of hooves and the muted calls of merchants opening stalls. You're in Iberia again, this time along a stretch of land ruled by the Kingdom of Aragon. Mountains rise behind you, pale and jagged, and the sea shimmers in the distance, calm and deceptively innocent. You trudge along narrow paths where the sun fights to warm the cold morning, aware that beneath the apparent serenity, history has quietly threaded a tapestry most people will never see. A rumor moves through the villages. A noble of dark skin walks among them. His presence is understated, almost invisible, but those paying attention notice his posture, his calm authority, the way people bow instinctively yet whisper about his lineage. Perhaps he is the heir of a long, forgotten African connection, a prince whose family merged quietly with Iberian nobility. He keeps a low profile because history has taught the prudent that visibility can be dangerous. Mainstream fact, during the medieval period, the Iberian Peninsula saw the arrival of African nobles and courtiers through marriage, migration, or political alliances, especially following the interactions between Christian and Muslim kingdoms. Records of their existence survive sporadically in charters, marriage contracts, and local accounts. You follow him through the cobbled streets of Zaragoza, past markets full of herbs, textiles, and bread baked in brick ovens. Children chase one another, shouting names that blur into laughter, while women bend over fountains, drawing water. No one challenges him, they merely sense that his presence carries weight. He is a quiet king in exile, his influence subtle, threading through decisions about land, tax, and diplomacy without ever needing to sit atop a throne. Here's your quirky tidbit. A local chronicle mentions a Moorish nobleman attending a council in Aragon who taught knights not only new combat tactics, but also the proper planting schedule for almond orchards. A combination of warfare and agriculture that seems odd to modern readers. Historians still argue whether these accounts refer to one individual or a series of African descended advisors, but either way, someone was clearly changing the way the land was tended and defended. You step into a palace courtyard where banners flutter in the wind. Inside, the noble speaks softly to the King of Aragon, suggesting alliances, advising on the integration of African and local troops, and quietly negotiating the terms of trade with distant ports. His words are precise, measured, and carry the weight of faraway kingdoms he has known intimately. You watch, fascinated by the balance he maintains. Power without ostentation, influence without display. The day heats up, and you wander to the hills outside the city. You see vineyards spreading across terraced slopes, olive groves lining paths like quiet sentinels. Somewhere among these trees, the noble walks, inspecting harvests, giving advice to local farmers, and ensuring the kingdom flourishes. The presence of a black noble in Aragon is subtle, like a shadow at noon, but it is there, quietly shaping events. A gentle breeze carries the faint scent of orange blossoms, reminding you of the Sicilian days you walked among advisors and princes. There's a continuity here, a lineage of influence stretching from Andalusia to Sicily to Aragon. African bloodlines, knowledge, and experience have quietly touched Europe's courts, gardens, and farmlands. You pause to rest by a fountain, listening to the water ripple. A stray dog curls near your feet, ignoring the occasional passing villager. You think of how history erases some faces while keeping others. How some kings are painted in frescoes and others in fading memory. Yet, in places like this, the footprints remain, if you know how to see them. Historians still debate the exact identity of these black nobles in Iberia, questioning whether records refer to specific individuals, families, or generalized titles for African descended courtiers. But as you sit there, it feels obvious someone was here, shaping decisions, guiding trade, teaching strategies, and ensuring the survival of a lineage quietly threaded into Europe's story. The sun begins to dip, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Lanterns flicker to life as evening settles. Somewhere within the palace, the noble reviews maps of trade routes, stretching from the Mediterranean to the African coast, ensuring that alliances and goods flow efficiently. A soft smile crosses his face, private and unrecorded, because history prefers grandeur over nuance. You lean back against the fountain, letting the water's gentle lap lull your thoughts. This is a kingdom built quietly, not with loud proclamations, but with patient guidance, diplomacy, and quiet oversight. The black noble of Aragon moves among it seamlessly, invisible to the many yet deeply present. As night fully envelopes the city, the stars appear above, shimmering like scattered jewels. You trace constellations with your eyes, wondering if this noble ever did the same, thinking of lands beyond the horizon, dreaming of ancestors and descendants who might not remember him by name, but would inherit his influence nonetheless. You continue your journey, moving northeast now, across the Pyrenees into lands known as Aquitaine and Gascony. The mountains loom like silent sentinels, their peaks wrapped in morning fog, their valleys fertile with forests and rivers. The air smells of pine resin and wet earth. The ground soft under your boots. Villagers cling to the slopes, whitewashed cottages with smoke curling from chimneys. You can hear the faint toll of church bells echoing across the hills. Amid the pastoral calm, a story stirs. The tale of African knights serving in the courts and armies of southwestern France. These men are neither fully celebrated nor fully forgotten. They ride, they fight, they advise, yet they are seldom immortalized in grand tapestries. Still, their presence is undeniable to anyone watching closely. Strong, competent, skilled in horsemanship and diplomacy alike. Mainstream fact. In the 9th and 10th centuries, documents from southern French regions record African descended soldiers and courtiers integrated into local nobility, particularly along trade routes with Spain. These men often held military titles or served as advisors, blending martial skill with diplomacy. You follow one such figure into a fortified town perched above a river. His armor is worn but well maintained, leather straps polished, chainmail glinting under the sun. He dismounts with ease, his movements precise and confident. Villagers bow, not in fear, but in recognition of competence and authority. His influence is subtle but pervasive, a hand that guides without needing to be overt. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some chronicles mention African descended knights teaching European cavalry new formations influenced by North African tactics, including flexible infantry coordination and mounted archery. Historians still argue whether these contributions were widespread or isolated anecdotes, but they hint at a quiet transfer of knowledge. Inside the town hall, he meets with local lords, discussing crop distribution, defense strategies, and trade agreements. His words are measured, his tone calm, almost hypnotic. Everyone listens because he has earned their respect, not because of rank, but because of knowledge and reliability. You notice the subtle ways he negotiates. A pause here, a nod there, a shift in posture that changes the room's energy. You wander outside to the ramparts as the afternoon sun filters through clouds. The river below glints like molten glass. Farmers tend to vineyards, shepherds guide flocks, children splash in the shallows. You think of the African kingdoms that once sent emissaries along these rivers. Kingdoms whose maps were long forgotten by Western scribes. Their influence is here, in techniques, crops, and strategies, invisible but foundational. A small chapel near the edge of town catches your attention. Inside, frescoes depict knights in armor, some with darker skin tones, intermingling with local nobility. You crouch to examine a figure, his eyes stern but noble. This could be one of the many African descended knights whose deeds are remembered only in faint pigments and fragmented accounts. You pause outside, taking a deep breath. The air is scented with lavender, pine, and whetstone. Somewhere along the horizon, a horse neighs, a dog barks, and you hear the faint murmur of a distant stream. The past feels alive here, layered, intertwined, resilient. Historians still debate whether these African descended figures were permanent fixtures of European courts, or temporary emissaries and mercenaries who left traces too fleeting to document thoroughly. But the echoes of their influence remain. In military formations, in diplomatic approaches, and in the quiet presence they commanded. You follow the knight as he patrols the town walls, observing trade routes and ensuring security. He pauses at the edge, looking out over the valley, the sunlight catching the bronze of his skin. He smiles faintly, satisfied. The work he does is unrecorded by most, but it matters, quietly, profoundly, and persistently. The sun sinks, casting long shadows across the town. Lanterns flicker to life, smoke curls from chimneys, and the river reflects the stars emerging overhead. You sit on the rampart, letting the calm of the valley seep into your bones, thinking of all the forgotten kings, knights, and advisors who shaped these lands in silence. Tonight, Aquitaine remembers them in echoes, if not in textbooks. You continue east, leaving the gentle valleys of Aquitaine behind, heading toward the bustling trade centers of northern Italy. The air grows warmer as you descend from the mountains, scented with vineyards, wildflowers, and the faint tang of the Adriatic Sea. Cobblestone streets wind between stone towers and brick facades, carrying the hum of merchants, artisans, and travelers from across Europe and Africa. This is a land in constant negotiation of goods, ideas, and influence, and you feel the pulse of history beneath your feet. In the heart of Florence, though it is still a city of smaller importance than it will become, a black nobleman walks among the merchants. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and wears robes dyed in deep crimson and gold. His eyes scan the streets and canals, calculating, observing, measuring. He carries with him the weight of distant kingdoms, the knowledge of African trade routes, and the subtle authority of someone accustomed to shaping events without drawing attention. Mainstream fact: medieval Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Florence, frequently employed African and North African advisors, mercenaries, and merchants who facilitated trade with the Maghreb and beyond. Their contributions ranged from finance to military strategy, and some integrated into local nobility through marriage or patronage. You follow him through a crowded market where the smell of spices, cinnamon, cloves, and cumin mixes with freshly baked bread. Children run past, laughing, while merchants haggle in multiple languages. He greets a trader from Tunis, shaking hands and exchanging subtle gestures of respect and acknowledgement. In this world, knowledge and reputation travel faster than coin. Here's your quirky tidbit: some Florentine chronicles describe African-born merchants introducing new forms of accounting and currency management, allowing the city to thrive commercially. Historians still argue whether these innovations were widespread or limited to elite trading circles, but the economic growth they influenced is undeniable. You watch as he enters a guild hall. Inside, artisans and traders discuss contracts, logistics, and partnerships with representatives from North Africa and the Levant. The nobleman's input is precise and valued. He suggests routes, resolves disputes, and occasionally reminds them of the human cost of commerce. Every word carries weight because he has earned it. Outside, the Arno River glimmers under the sun. Gondolas and small boats ferry goods and passengers, their movement rhythmic and purposeful. You imagine the African advisors navigating these waters centuries earlier, ensuring the flow of textiles, gold, and knowledge into Europe. They are silent architects of wealth, threading networks invisible to most chroniclers. A fresco in a nearby chapel catches your eye. It depicts a council of rulers, their features European, but one figure's skin is distinctly darker. The brushstrokes are faded, but you recognize the presence of someone whose influence shaped policies, built trade routes, and fostered cultural exchange. You pause in the piazza, listening to the chatter of merchants and the distant ringing of church bells. The city feels alive, layered with the footsteps of countless travelers, scholars, and advisors. You think about how many of these African figures were remembered only in passing, their deeds invisible to the casual observer, yet integral to the city's growth and prosperity. Historians still debate whether the African descended nobles and advisors in Italy were permanent residents or temporary visitors, but the evidence in trade, law, and culture shows a clear and lasting imprint. Their presence shaped economic systems, urban planning, and diplomatic practices in ways that would echo for centuries. The sun begins to set, casting long, golden reflections across the water. Lanterns flicker to life, their glow mingling with the last rays of sunlight. Somewhere in the crowd, the nobleman adjusts his robe and continues his work, negotiating, observing, influencing. His legacy is quiet but enduring, like a river carving through stone. You step back, letting the evening settle over the city. The streets hum softly, the water murmurs, and the distant hills shimmer in fading light. Here, Florence remembers him in commerce, in architecture, in subtle shifts of power. Even if the history books do not, you continue northward, leaving Italy behind and crossing into the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of northern France. The flat, wind-swept plains are dotted with windmills, rivers, and small villages clustered along canals. The air smells of damp earth, freshly baked bread, and the faint tang of livestock. You trudge through mud-slick roads, listening to the distant cries of market vendors and the low hum of water wheels. Here, trade is king, and commerce is the lifeblood of society. Among these villages and trading posts walks a figure of remarkable presence. His skin is dark, rich as polished mahogany, and his robes are subtly embroidered with geometric patterns reminiscent of North African design. He is a merchant, yes, but more than that, a negotiator, an envoy, a man whose influence stretches beyond the borders of the Low Countries into northern France, England, and even the Mediterranean. His eyes are sharp, taking in the tiniest details of human behavior, inventory, and diplomacy. Mainstream fact: from the 12th century onward, North African and sub-Saharan African merchants were documented in ports and cities across the Low Countries, participating in trade, diplomacy, and sometimes even military escort. They were instrumental in connecting Europe to Mediterranean and African trade networks. You follow him into a bustling market along the Scheldt River. Cloth merchants from Ghent, grain traders from Bruges, and spice traders from Africa and the Levant haggle in overlapping languages. He moves with confidence, exchanging goods and advice, mediating disputes, and leaving agreements as he goes. The local guild masters respect him. Some even defer to his knowledge of distant markets. Here's your quirky tidbit. One account describes an African merchant introducing a new method of preserving salted fish for long-distance transport, which revolutionized local diets and trade. Historians still argue whether this story is literal or exaggerated, but the concept demonstrates the tangible influence of African knowledge on European everyday life. You walk along a canal, observing barges loaded with goods, barrels, bales of cloth, crates of citrus fruits. The merchant stops to greet the captain of a ship from Tunis. They exchange letters and negotiate cargo space with a subtle nod, almost invisibly. Yet these small gestures ripple through trade networks, shaping economies hundreds of miles away. You pause at a small chapel where a mural depicts a courtly scene. Among the pale figures, one man has skin darker than the rest, his stance confident, his hands gesturing as if in debate. It's a rare depiction of African presence in Northern European visual culture, subtle but unmistakable. You crouch, tracing the brushstrokes, imagining the lives behind them. Historians still debate the identity and status of African figures in the Low Countries, questioning whether they were long-term residents, visiting envoys, or integrated into local nobility. Regardless, the marks of their presence endure in trade networks, architectural influence, and cultural exchange. As dusk settles, the canals shimmer with reflected lantern light. Barges drift lazily, the water whispering against the banks. The merchant walks along the quay, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the evening's transactions. He does not need to raise his voice. His influence is understood, respected, and carried silently through the community. You step back from the river, letting the cool night air brush your face. Somewhere along these waterways, across cities and countrysides, the stories of African traders, knights, and advisors ripple quietly. They leave footprints in stone, in commerce, in whispers of diplomacy, enduring, yet often unrecognized. You inhale deeply, smelling the damp earth and distant sea, realizing that the Low Countries remember these men in the structure of trade and city life, even if history has forgotten their names. You continue your journey northeast, crossing into the dense forests and rolling hills of the Holy Roman Empire. What will one day be Germany and Central Europe? The air is cooler here, tinged with pine, moss, and the faint scent of smoke from village hearths. Narrow roads wind through timbered houses and small market squares, carrying the sound of woodcutters, smiths, and the occasional clatter of armored boots. Here, power is dispersed among dukes, bishops, and emperors, but influence travels quietly through courtiers and advisors. In one small principality, you spot a figure moving with an unusual composure. His skin is dark, almost luminous against the pale European landscape, and he wears a tunic adorned with subtle motifs from distant lands. He is an advisor to the local duke, though his authority is earned, not granted by lineage. Villagers whisper as he passes, half in awe, half in fear, but mostly curiosity. He carries knowledge that bridges continents, the strategies of African kingdoms, the diplomacy of Mediterranean courts, and the subtleties of European feudal politics. Mainstream fact records from the Holy Roman Empire mention African descended advisors, envoys, and mercenary commanders integrated into the courts of regional rulers, especially along trade routes connecting Italy, France, and Eastern Europe. These individuals often served as cultural intermediaries, military strategists, and economic consultants. You follow him through a market, where traders from distant lands haggle over spices, textiles, and metalwork. His presence is subtle but commanding. He negotiates with calm authority, resolving conflicts and ensuring fair exchange. The villagers notice, but few understand the breadth of his knowledge. Only that he is effective. Here's your quirky tidbit. Chronicles describe an African advisor introducing innovations in water management for castle moats and agricultural irrigation. Techniques borrowed from North African engineering. Historians still debate whether these interventions were widely adopted or limited to select estates, but the influence is tangible in surviving infrastructure. Inside the Duke's Hall, he advises on military logistics. He points out where fortifications could be strengthened, where troops should be stationed, and how supply lines should be organized. The Duke listens intently, trusting the judgment of a man whose experience spans continents and cultures. His counsel is decisive in skirmishes that could otherwise have shifted the balance of power in the region. Outside, the forests stretch endlessly, shadows lengthening with the sinking sun. You wander along a riverbank, the water reflecting the fading light. You imagine this advisor walking the same paths centuries earlier, considering alliances, directing defenses, and quietly shaping the fate of a principality largely unaware of the depth of his contributions. Historians still argue whether these African figures were exceptional anomalies or representatives of a broader, largely invisible pattern of cross-cultural influence in medieval Central Europe. Standing here, it's clear their presence shaped military, economic, and diplomatic frameworks in ways still traceable, if subtle. As night falls, the village settles. Lanterns flicker through timbered windows, and the forest sighs softly in the wind. The advisor pauses at the edge of a hill, looking out over the principality he helps govern. His gaze is steady, calm, and deliberate. Even unrecorded in grand histories, his work has lasting consequences, protecting lives, shaping trade, and quietly rewriting the rules of governance. You feel the weight of centuries in that quiet moment, a legacy that lingers in stone, river, and market, waiting for someone to remember it. And tonight you do. You continue eastward, leaving the dense forests and river valleys behind as you enter the vast plains of Eastern Europe. Lands that will one day include Hungary, Poland, and the Balkans. The wind is sharper here, carrying hints of grass, wildflowers, and the faint smoke of distant hearths. Villages cluster along rivers, and small forts punctuate the horizon. The air vibrates with the hum of trade, movement, and political intrigue. a network of power sprawling quietly across this untamed landscape. In one fortified town, a figure of striking presence moves along the walls. His skin is dark, his robes lined with subtle embroidery reflecting African craftsmanship, and his gait exudes authority. He is a military advisor and nobleman, sent from a distant African kingdom to serve in the courts of Eastern Europe. His arrival is met with curiosity, sometimes suspicion, but his competence quickly earns respect. Mainstream fact: during the 13th and 14th centuries, African and North African nobles, mercenaries, and advisors were occasionally documented in Eastern European courts, particularly those seeking alliances or expertise from Mediterranean kingdoms. These figures often served as intermediaries in diplomacy, trade, and military strategy. You follow him into a hall where banners ripple in the cold light. He advises on troop placement along the river, suggesting defensive positions that incorporate both European and African tactical innovations. The Duke listens intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally questioning, but always acknowledging the depth of knowledge before him. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some chronicles mention African-born knights teaching local forces the use of cavalry maneuvers inspired by North African and Arab techniques, including mounted archery and rapid flanking strategies. Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or isolated to certain campaigns, but the results influence the military effectiveness of the region. Outside, children play along the riverbank, unaware that this advisor's presence has shaped their safety, trade, and livelihoods. You watch as he inspects fortifications, quietly noting weaknesses in walls and gates. His attention to detail is meticulous, informed by a lifetime of navigating foreign courts and distant battlefields. You wander through the town, noting the small traces of cultural fusion: spices from Mediterranean ports, textiles in unusual colors and patterns, and architectural flourishes hinting at African or Arab design. These are subtle, almost invisible legacies, the fingerprints of travelers, advisors, and nobles whose work remains largely unrecorded. Historians still argue whether these African figures in Eastern Europe were permanent residents or temporary advisors, and whether their influence was symbolic or substantial. Yet, as you walk these streets, it's clear their expertise shaped governance, defense, and local culture in ways that quietly persisted. At dusk, the town quiets. Lanterns flicker in windows, the wind sighs through the plains, and the river mirrors the last light of the sun. You find the advisor standing atop the ramparts, surveying the territory. His gaze is steady, calm, and far-reaching. He embodies a lineage of African nobility navigating European courts, shaping politics, strategy, and culture. Unseen yet profoundly impactful. You take a moment to imagine the countless footsteps, strategies, and decisions that will never appear in textbooks, yet left a mark on generations to come. Tonight, the plains remember him, if only in memory and influence. You travel northeast now, across rivers that gleam silver in the morning light, into the Baltic regions. Lands that will one day be called Poland, Lithuania, and the Teutonic territories. The air is crisp, carrying pine, salt from the sea, and the faint scent of freshly turned earth. Villagers huddle around wooden churches, and the occasional fortified castle punctuates the horizon. This is a land of borders, trade, and complex loyalties, where influence often travels in whispers, rather than proclamations. Among these towns and strongholds, you notice a figure moving with quiet authority. His skin is deep bronze, contrasting against the pale European landscape, and his clothing bears subtle patterns reminiscent of North African or Saharan artistry. He is a military strategist and royal advisor, dispatched to the courts of Northern Europe by distant African kingdoms, seeking alliances and knowledge. His presence is both unusual and commanding, a reminder that the medieval world was more interconnected than most imagine. Mainstream fact: Documents from the 13th and 14th centuries reference African descended knights, diplomats, and advisors traveling or residing in northern European courts, often mediating alliances and influencing military and political strategy. Their presence reflects the far-reaching networks of medieval trade, diplomacy, and warfare. You follow him into a fortified hall where local lords gather. He speaks with calm precision, advising on the placement of troops along riverbanks and forests, the construction of fortifications, and the optimal timing of patrols. His suggestions blend North African techniques with European tactics, creating strategies both innovative and practical. The lords listen attentively, sometimes questioning, always learning. Here's your quirky tidbit. Chroniclers note that one African advisor introduced a method of signaling between watchtowers using reflective metal plates and early semaphore techniques, improving communication across vast distances. Historians still debate whether this system was widely used or symbolic, but it highlights the ingenuity and adaptability of these figures. Outside, villagers continue their daily routines, tending crops, caring for livestock, and hauling water from wells. Few notice the advisor moving among them, but his influence shapes their lives. From securing safe passage along trade routes to advising on crop rotation, his work quietly stabilizes the region. You pause by the edge of a river, watching barges laden with grain and timber. The advisor walks past, pausing to exchange a brief nod with a local captain. In his gestures, you sense the weight of centuries of knowledge, diplomacy, and survival. He is a bridge between continents, cultures, and generations. Historians still argue whether the African figures in these northern courts were isolated individuals or part of broader, enduring networks of influence. Yet the traces remain, in fortifications, trade routes, tactical manuals, and subtle cultural exchanges. As the sun sets, casting amber light over the rivers and villages, the advisor surveys the landscape from the top of the castle walls. His presence is quiet but undeniable, a living testament to the interconnectedness of medieval Europe and Africa. You breathe in the cool evening air, listening to the distant tolling of bells, feeling the pulse of history moving beneath your feet. Somewhere in the shadows, the rivers remember him, the forests remember him, and tonight, so do you. You journey further east, into the vast steppes and forests of what will one day be Russia and Ukraine. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine, wildflowers, and smoke from small village hearths. Rivers snake across the plains like silver ribbons, and settlements cluster along their banks, fortified by timber palisades. The horizon stretches endlessly, dotted with distant watchtowers and the occasional castle, reminders of human endeavor against both nature and neighbor. Here, in a frontier town, a figure of dark skin moves with calm authority. His robes are practical but subtly decorated, hinting at distant lands. He is an envoy, an advisor, sent from a kingdom far across the Mediterranean, possibly even Africa itself. Locals regard him with curiosity, sometimes suspicion, yet his skill and wisdom command respect. In a land where survival is a daily negotiation, competence matters more than appearance. Mainstream fact. Historical records indicate that African descended individuals occasionally served in courts and military campaigns in Eastern Europe, functioning as envoys, mercenary leaders, and strategic advisors. Their influence often extended into trade, diplomacy, and military organization. You follow him to a council chamber, where regional leaders convene. He advises on troop deployment, river defenses, and alliances with neighboring principalities. His knowledge blends strategies learned in Mediterranean campaigns with local conditions, creating solutions that feel both exotic and effective. The council listens closely, occasionally questioning, but invariably deferring to his experience. Here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicle recounts an African advisor introducing the cultivation of certain spices and grains previously unknown in northern climates, subtly altering local cuisine and agriculture. Historians still debate whether these accounts are factual or exaggerated, but they underscore the tangible influence of African knowledge in Europe. Outside, children play along the riverbanks, and villagers tend their fields and livestock. The advisor walks among them, ensuring trade routes remain safe, borders defended, and justice fairly administered. He is a quiet architect of stability, shaping life in ways that few chroniclers record. You pause by a small chapel where faded frescoes depict figures in armor. Among them, one has unmistakably dark skin, standing confidently alongside European nobility. You crouch to study the details, the curve of his face, the placement of his hands, subtle markers of presence and authority in a world that rarely acknowledged him fully. Historians still argue whether these African figures were rare anomalies or representatives of a broader, largely undocumented network of influence stretching across medieval Europe. Standing here, it feels clear that their contributions in strategy, trade, and diplomacy left enduring marks on local and regional development. As night falls, lanterns flicker across timbered streets and palisades. The river mirrors the stars emerging overhead, and the advisor stands atop the walls, surveying his territory. He is a bridge between continents, a living testament to the interwoven history of Africa and Europe. You step back, letting the cold wind brush against your face, reflecting on the thousands of unseen decisions, negotiations, and innovations he facilitated. The night seems to hum with memory, carrying whispers of influence, resilience, and quiet power. You push onward into the northern reaches of Europe, into the kingdoms that will one day be Scandinavia. The air is sharp and brisk, carrying the scent of pine, sea salt, and the faint smoke of hearth fires. Fjords cut into the coastline like silver knives, and wooden longhouses huddle along the shorelines, their thatched roofs dark against the pale sky. The landscape is rugged, beautiful, and merciless, a land that tests endurance and cunning at every turn. Among the settlements, a figure of deep bronze skin moves with measured grace. His robes are heavy, suited to the chill, and embroidered with faint geometric patterns that hint at a distant origin. He is a nobleman, an advisor, a strategist, and a silent force shaping the courts of Scandinavian kings. His presence is both commanding and understated, respected by those who recognize his competence and knowledge, overlooked by those who rely solely on appearance. Mainstream fact: historical records suggest that African and North African individuals occasionally held positions of influence in northern European courts, acting as advisors, diplomats, or military consultants. Their impact, while subtle, contributed to political decisions, trade strategies, and cultural exchange. You follow him along the coast as the tide ebbs, watching the fishermen haul in nets brimming with herring. His knowledge of trade, both local and international, ensures prosperity for the region. He consults with the king on maritime strategy, fortification placement, and the allocation of resources for defense and commerce. Each suggestion is precise, informed by experiences in Africa, the Mediterranean, and southern Europe, adapted seamlessly to the northern environment. Here's your quirky tidbit. Chronicles mention an African-born advisor introducing new techniques for preserving fish and storing grain in colder climates, methods inspired by practices in faraway lands. Historians still debate the authenticity of these accounts, but they highlight the practical influence these figures exerted on daily life. Inside the Longhouse Council, the nobleman speaks softly but decisively. The king nods, trusting the wisdom of a man who has navigated far more complex courts and cultures. Outside, villagers move through the settlement, unaware that their security, trade, and prosperity are shaped by the guidance of someone whose name might never appear in history books. You wander to the edge of a cliff overlooking the fjord, where the wind whips saltwater spray across your face. The nobleman stands beside you, scanning the horizon, imagining threats and opportunities in equal measure. He is a bridge between continents and worlds, a living testament to Africa's influence stretching even to the far north. Historians still argue whether these northern advisors were isolated figures or part of a broader, sustained network of African influence across Europe. Yet, as you look out over the fjords, the villages, and the forests, it feels undeniable their impact is present in fortifications, trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, even if largely unrecorded. Night falls. Lanterns flicker along the shoreline, and the wind carries whispers of ancient seas and distant kingdoms. You think of the countless footsteps, decisions, and innovations these black kings and advisors contributed to medieval Europe, shaping a continent quietly, profoundly, and invisibly. The stars emerge, mirrored in the calm fjords. You take a deep breath, feeling the vastness of the world, and the threads of history connecting Africa to every corner of Europe. Somewhere in the shadows, these forgotten kings and advisors remain, guiding, shaping, and enduring. The night grows still. The cold northern air softens as you sit upon a cliff, letting the fjord's waves whisper their steady rhythm. All across Europe, from the plains of the Low Countries to the forests of the Holy Roman Empire, from the Mediterranean islands to the Baltic coasts, traces of these forgotten black kings and advisors linger like echoes in stone, water, and soil. They walked among kings and villagers alike, shaping policy, trade, defense, and daily life with wisdom, experience, and quiet authority. You imagine them in their courts, guiding rulers, whispering advice, innovating in agriculture and military strategy. You picture them on distant trade routes, negotiating agreements that ensured prosperity, moving invisibly but leaving indelible marks on towns and kingdoms. They were neither loud nor boastful, yet their impact resonates in ways textbooks seldom capture. The world is vast and quiet now. Lanterns flicker in faraway villages, fires burn low, and rivers glint under the silver light of the moon. You feel the depth of time, the weight of unseen hands that shaped history without recognition. Their footsteps echo through palaces, marketplaces, and fortifications, their influence carried across generations. Breathe slowly. Let the sounds of distant rivers, rustling forests, and the occasional sea wave fill your senses. Feel the presence of these remarkable figures, black kings, advisors, and envoys, whose legacies are woven subtly but irrevocably into the tapestry of Europe. Their stories remind you that history is never simple, never only what is written. It is layered, intertwined, and alive. As you close your eyes, let the memory of their quiet power and enduring influence wash over you. Let the gentle night, the cool breeze, and the soft lap of water carry you into rest. History has many voices, and tonight, you have heard one that whispers, teaches, and lingers. Sleep softly. Let these echoes of forgotten kings cradle you, reminding you that even in quiet, influence endures. Sweet dreams.